Facilities that make this program possible are provided by the City of Highland Park. Programs are produced independently by members of the community. The City of Highland Park is not affiliated with the following program or the producers of public access programming and is not responsible for the content. The following program does not reflect the opinions of the City of Highland Park.
And welcome to Cahnmann's Current Events Roundtable. Today we are very, very proud to welcome a very distinguished guest from a very distinguished lawyer from Harvard and who has his own practice now in Chicago, a very wonderful practice, and a very distinguished lawyer, Lowell Sachnoff. Welcome, Lowell, to Cahnmann's Current Events Roundtable.
Glad to be here, Suzanne.
And the topic that we're going to be doing is something that there's been a lot of controversy on: Guantanamo, a legal stain on the American justice system. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And I just want to give them a little bit of your resume. Again, I said you went to Harvard Law School, you're a distinguished Chicago lawyer, and you're an advocate for several non-terrorist detainees. You received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Lawyer for his successful career in business and advocating for women, minorities, the poor, and inspiring others to do likewise. I am very, very proud to have you on my show because you go out there and you're what lawyers are supposed to be, what they used to be like, and you're the very type of lawyer that old school lawyer that we've had for many years, and we're very proud that you're there for us.
And I'm happy to do the work that I do in Guantanamo. As I've said before, I practiced law for over 50 years, but I realized that representing innocent men like the prisoners at Guantanamo is why I have a law license, and I'm proud to do it.
And how did you get interested in, first of all, you have to go to Cuba, correct?
That's correct. We have to visit Guantanamo.
You got to go to Cuba. You got to visit Guantanamo. It takes a big chunk out of your life, and your family and everything else. And how do you? First of all, you get into the prison, and I think you were telling me, which is very interesting, earlier, that it costs $3 million a year, the taxpayer of the United States, to keep our detainees per person.
That's
$3 million a year per person to keep the detainees there in Guantanamo. That's a big chunk of money.
Well, that's correct, Suzanne, because Guantanamo, the prison at Guantanamo Naval Station, is a huge 45 square mile piece of the end of Cuba, and the base requires an enormous amount of service in terms of military and civilian personnel. At one time, there were over 700 prisoners at Guantanamo, and even at that time, the cost was $1 million per prisoner. There are only 120 prisoners left in Guantanamo, and you're quite correct that it costs $3 million a year to keep each prisoner in Guantanamo. And if you compare that to the cost of maintaining a prisoner at a super max federal prison here in America, like Leavenworth or Singfield or Sing Sing, where the cost is only about $50,000 a year, it gives you an idea of the enormous cost to the United States of maintaining this prison that, as we'll talk about later, is a stain, a moral and legal stain on our justice system.
And we do have room for them in our prisons, so we could keep them in our prisons. Why do we keep them there? And first of all, why don't you tell us, first of all, how the United States obtained Guantanamo Bay Naval Station? I know for a fact that we pay Cuba rent for this Guantanamo,
Sure.
right?
That's correct. It happened as a result of the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century, where we assisted Cuba in its fight not to be taken over by Spain. And in return for that, we demanded concessions from Cuba, one of which was we obtained a perpetual lease on the Guantanamo Naval Station forever, and for a lease payment of $5,000 a year. And as a quick aside, Batista, who ran Cuba until the Castro took over, would actually cash his checks. Castro has never cashed them at all. But that's how it happened. That's how we obtained this large piece of land on which the prison is located.
And I understand that we're talking about being able to travel to Cuba, but one of the concessions are they want this piece of land back, don't they?
Well, it's somewhat of an aside, but during recent negotiations between the Cuban and American administration to ease the restrictions and embargo on our doing business with Cuba, one of the first things the Cuban negotiators always ask for is, we want Guantanamo back, you stole it from us, and we want it back. And it's interesting to note, Suzanne, that today the naval station at Guantanamo has no real strategic value for the United States at all. Oddly enough, when I was in the Navy 50 years ago, I went to Guantanamo and you would see battleships and destroyers and cruisers there. Today, the only naval ships you see are tugboats. And the joke is that maybe Guantanamo helps defend us against the possible invasion from, say, Grenada.
Oh, that's interesting. That's funny. But why do we? What is the problem? You know, there's a big political thing that if we remove our prisoners or the detainees, they're called detainees because they've been detained without very little. We haven't done any law for them. We didn't prove that they're innocent. We didn't even prove that they were guilty. And that's one of the things that you do. You go in and defend some of these detainees. But I guess what they're worried about is if you let these people go, they'll go back to their native countries, if they're from Yemen or from Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or wherever, where they come from. Number one, they will go back there and they will become terrorists again.
Well, let me tell you what the data shows, Suzanne, that of the prisoners who've been released from Guantanamo, and they really are prisoners, they're called detainees, but they're incarcerated in a prison. Of those who've been released, during the Bush administration, when over 500 were released, about 15% of them returned to the battlefield, that is, returned to other countries to be terrorists. Under the Obama administration, it's about 6%. But when you think about it, even if you were an absolutely innocent person when you went to Guantanamo, but you were held there illegally without being charged at all and never tried, and suddenly you're released after 12 years of prison, you might have an animus towards America. So it's possible that some of the prisoners who are being released now might return, as they say, to the battlefield or become terrorists. It's a small number, and one of the reasons that it's difficult to get any of the prisoners out of Guantanamo now is that the United States has to establish that they aren't terrorists and there never will be, which is almost impossible. Last fact there, the recidivist rate today from federal prisons in terms of prisoners who are released back into society, over 25% of them return to crime. So compared to those statistics, the numbers for Guantanamo prisoners is small.
Yeah, because I know, and I believe it's Finland and Norway, where they have prisons. Ours are, it's like keeping our prisoners there. They're trying to rehabilitate, and we don't rehabilitate. That's one of our big problems, of our prison system. They don't become rehabilitated because they, I think it was in Finland that they even have their own rooms, by the way, in Finland, the prison system, and they come back. But here that's right. If you're in a prison and I don't know what's going on. They may be waterboarded. They may be all kinds of things. I know that they a lot of times put them in confinement, and by the time they get out, maybe you're correct. They become maybe terrorists hanging around with all of them every day, rather than showing them a different type of life, because maybe we are like terrorists to them, the way we keep them. We act like, You know,
Sure.
they're supposedly the terrorists, but when we, do all these things, are we the terrorists?
Well, you're quite right about one thing. During the Bush administration and before the prisoners at Guantanamo had a right to have lawyers, there was a good deal of abuse and ill treatment of the prisoners there. After Obama became president, and for the last 6 years, there's been no waterboarding, no torture. As Obama said, we don't torture, and we have not mistreated the prisoners there. They're still incarcerated. They're still in jail, in effect. And so many of them, as I'll talk about later, are absolutely innocent and never been charged with a crime. That in itself is an abuse of the American justice system, what I've called a stain.
You also mentioned, we were talking a little bit earlier before our show went on, we talked about that there are bounty hunters, and a lot of them, the reason they're there was because they were offered money, and people were offered money to find a prisoner so they can. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
I will, and that's quite important, Suzanne. I'm glad you raised that. So many of the prisoners at Guantanamo are young Muslim men who were captured in Afghanistan and some in Pakistan shortly after 9/11, shortly after the attack on the World Trade Centers, at a time when America invaded Afghanistan searching for the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And at that time, there were bounties of up to $5,000 and $10,000 if two people would point to you and say, she looks like a terrorist to me. That's all that was necessary for so many of the prisoners in Guantanamo. Of course, no women ever went there. They'd have to point to me. But that was the reason so many of the prisoners at Guantanamo got there, because they were sold for bounties in a country where the average annual income is $400 a year. A $5,000 bounty would attract a lot of that kind of activity.
So you're saying a lot of these people were never terrorists. They fit the profile, so therefore these people wanted to make $5,000, and maybe $5,000 to you or me isn't that a lot of money, but somebody that's making $400 a year, imagine $400 a year, $5,000 like millions of dollars to them.
That is correct.
So that's that's something that I don't think people know about.
Now, Suzanne, that isn't true of all the prisoners in Guantanamo, because of course there's a full range of them. They range all the way from what's called a high-resolution prisoners like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 of his associates who've been charged with masterminding the attack on the World Trade Centers that resulted in 9/11. They may well, and if they're convicted, be established as hardcore criminals, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be subjected and have available to them the protections of the American legal system, which they've never had in Guantanamo at all.
I mean, we had that they rounded up the Nazis during World War II, and they had a trial. Remember the Eichmann trial?
Sure.
I mean, that was a very famous trial. We knew he was a mass murderer, but he had a trial.
Yes, and that's one of the things those of us who represent prisoners at Guantanamo are demanding. First, that they be released to the United States, all of them, not just my clients who've never been charged and who've been cleared for release but are there for political reasons. But there's no reason why all of those prisoners can't be brought stateside to the United States, tried in criminal courts like other terrorists have been, and then we would remove the stain of Guantanamo on our country that's been a major recruiting source for terrorists, for the Taliban, for Al-Qaeda, for ISIS. When ISIS has killed people in Syria and other countries, they've dressed them in orange jumpsuits so that they would look and they would say, look what you do in Guantanamo, we can do the same thing, so why are you criticizing us?
Talking about orange jumpsuits, you gave me a little picture of the prisoners that I just want to show our viewers. Can we get a camera on, let's see, there we are. Can we do that again? Can we do that again? Because I think we just got it for a second. There they are.
Sure.
See all the prisoners, and they're in the orange jumpsuits.
Yeah, and that's become
when we have beheadings. If you remember, when we have beheadings of our American soldiers and military and people, journalists. If you remember, guess what they're wearing?
Yeah, they've dressed
the orange jumpsuit, just like that.
And what I'm saying is Guantanamo is not just a stain on the American judicial system, but it's a security risk for our country, because using Guantanamo abroad has been they've enabled ISIS, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban to recruit suicide bombers whom they dress up in orange jumpsuits and say, I'm killing myself and other people because of what you've done in Guantanamo.
So you feel that if Guantanamo is closed, that we will not, I mean, we'll still have terrorists, but they won't be mocking and they won't be trying to imitate what's going on in Guantanamo.
Well, that's the reason that President Obama, in his first executive order in 2009, said he wanted to close Guantanamo in a year. And I've been a supporter of President Obama, but I've been quite critical of him for not having done so. And recently he finally said, I should have closed Guantanamo the first year.
Why hasn't he?
Well, he hasn't done it because in 2010, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives, they insisted on adding amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act that funds the troops, so Obama couldn't veto it, restrictions that make it almost impossible to have any of these prisoners released from Guantanamo. There are huge hurdles that have to be overcome. They can be done, it can be done, but it takes an enormous amount of time and effort to do that. And now there are only 120 since Obama became president. There were 240, now there are only 120 prisoners there. And he is committed to closing it this year.
What about military trials? Would people get confused why can't the military try them rather than...
Because most of them who've been charged with crimes have been charged with crimes that are actually crimes under the American criminal judicial system. They could be tried for those offenses: murder, conspiracy, treason, whatever, in American criminal courts. And so there is something called the military commissions that were set up under a congressional statute in 2006, but there haven't been any successful trials at all, and I doubt if there will be under that military commission system.
What do you think is going to happen to these people? What is your feeling about Guantanamo? Do you think it's eventually going to be closed? Staying open and costing the taxpayer, it is the taxpayer that's paying $3 million per person. I mean, that's a lot of money we could be doing. Look at our...
Suzanne, what should happen is the 120 prisoners who are still left in Guantanamo fall into three categories. The hardcore, high-resolution, charged with crimes like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they should be brought to this country and tried like other terrorists have been in federal criminal courts. There are the cleared prisoners like my last client there at Tajik. They should be brought to our country and immediately relocated and resettled in other countries. And there's a batch that we don't have enough admissible evidence against these prisoners to be able to try them. Some of that evidence has been produced by torture and is inadmissible in federal courts. And those prisoners should either be tried on the basis of legitimate evidence that can be admitted, or they should be released and other countries found to take them. The prison should be closed. It is a stain on the American judicial system.
So how do you go in, and first of all, how did you get interested in defending these prisoners?
Yeah.
How did they allow you to come in and do it?
It wasn't until 2005 that the United States Supreme Court first held that these prisoners had the right to habeas corpus, the great writ to test the legality of their incarceration. And after that, a wonderful organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York was the intermediary that brought us lawyers, a lot of us senior lawyers like me, together with the prisoners at Guantanamo so that they would be entitled to judicial representation to test the legality of their incarceration.
Now, who
That's
pays
how they got
your
there.
fee with this?
Well, this is all. We do this pro bono.
Oh, so
no one pays
you
us.
do it pro bono.
As I said, this is why I have a law license.
See, so I was right. You're from the old school that really helps people. It's not all about the money.
Well, a lot of us are senior lawyers who are retired or semi-retired. A lot of us have done well practicing law. And I'm proud and honored to be able to use my law license to be able to represent and protect these prisoners and make sure that they get their full bevy of legal rights.
Now, is it hard to go back to their country of origin? I mean, you would think that maybe they wouldn't want... they wouldn't want to be returned there. First of all, maybe they wouldn't want to be returned there because they themselves could be killed there, or their families are afraid, or what is the situation?
Suzanne,
how do you do that?
You're quite right. It depends on the individual case. As I said, under the Bush administration, nearly 500 prisoners were released to their home countries. Most of them were Saudis, and President Bush had a good relationship with the Saudi kings, and most of the Saudis who were released went back to Saudi Arabia. On the other end of the spectrum, there are clients like my last client there, whose name is Mohammadi Davliadov. He's from Tajikistan, but his family was engaged in the insurrection against the government, and we had to fight to make sure that he was not returned to Tajikistan, where other Tajiks who've been sent back to Tajikistan from Guantanamo have been imprisoned or killed. So we need to find other countries for them, and there are lots of countries. For example, Uruguay just 2 months ago took 6 prisoners from Guantanamo. There were 4 Syrians, a Tunisian, and I think a Palestinian, and they're now resettled in Uruguay. Other countries, Albania, Spain, France, Bulgaria, have taken prisoners because they have good relationships with our country, and a lot of them have thrived. Some have not. Some have been seriously emotionally damaged after being held in Guantanamo all those years, but many of them are resettled and are doing fine.
When you say they're resettled, do they get an apartment? How do they afford to live?
Well,
I mean, who sponsors that? Is that the Center for Constitutional Rights? Or?
No, what happens is agreements are made. There's been a lot of publicity about the 6 detainees sent to Uruguay. They're living in a house right now, and part of the deal was that Uruguay would provide housing for them, subsistence allowance, services for their learning the language and helping them to get jobs. And the countries that we've negotiated for resettlement have all promised to provide these kinds of services for the detainees who are sent back there.
Now, when they're sent back, they're cleared of any wrongdoings, right?
Absolutely.
You can't send somebody back if you think that possibly they've done some kind of terrorist activities.
Yeah, they wouldn't be approved to be sent back there. That's one of the hurdles that has to be overcome, is a guarantee that these people, that these detainees who are about to be sent back to other countries are not terrorists and will not commit terrorist acts.
How do you prove that? How do you, as an attorney, how do you know that, the person could say, oh no, I wasn't, I was just taken for a bounty and I was not, I did not do any terrorist activities. How do you know?
Suzanne, the way you do that by doing what lawyers do is that you dig down into the details and the facts and establish, never to 100% guarantee, but at least as close as possible to assurance that these detainees were not terrorists and will not commit terrorist acts. Are you going to be right all the time? Probably not. Are we right most all the time? Yes, we are.
So the people that you that's the word is defended or promote, as that you cleared them for terrorist attacks. How have they fared? All the people you've had. How many people?
I've had
5.
No, I've had 4 that I've represented. 3 have been relocated to other countries. 2 of them are doing extremely well. 1 in Spain, 1 in Bulgaria. But one of our prisoners, a young man, a Palestinian from Gaza, picked up when he was 17 years old, didn't have much life, 12 years in Guantanamo, seriously emotionally damaged, and he is not doing great in a suburb of Madrid right now, but they're working with him to help him. When he first got out, he was hallucinating, and we thought he was schizophrenic, and the countries that take these detainees promise to give them assistance, and most all of them have done that.
That's been very encouraging. What about the United States? Have they taken anybody? Anybody here in the United States?
These amendments that I spoke of, the restrictive amendments, prohibit the transfer of any of the detainees in Guantanamo to the United States. That's another aspect of this moral and legal stain. That we ask other countries to take these prisoners, and you would think the other countries would say, well, why should I take in, or why should we take them when you won't? But they still do, which shows you the kind of persuasive force that the administration has today in the world. that they can get these promises from other countries when we won't take them. We can't take them under the present law. We will soon. I promise you that.
So they're working on to change the law. Didn't the Supreme Court rule on?
No. The Supreme Court has not addressed the issue of whether or not the detainees can be brought to the United States. To oversimplify it, it's a constitutional clash between the President, who under Article 2 of the Constitution is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In other words, he runs the wars, and the restrictions have been put in by Congress under their power of the purse, that is, that they govern expenditures. And right now, these restrictions say you can't use any federal money to move a prisoner to the United States. I think when that gets to the Supreme Court, the President's war powers will prevail, and I hope that before he is the end of his term, he'll exercise those powers and move every one of those prisoners.
How come it hasn't
here.
gone to the Supreme Court at this time yet?
The Supreme Court has not taken any Guantanamo cases at all since they've established 6 years ago that they were entitled to representation by lawyers and the protection of the writ of habeas corpus.
Okay.
There have been no cases on the merits that the Supreme Court has considered that address the legality of their incarceration.
Now, do most of the prisoners have a lawyer that's representing them? At this point, no?
Most all of the prisoners who remain in Guantanamo, the 120, have lawyers who represent them, correct.
And you have one more left?
I have one left, the Tajik.
Okay. Are you going to be taking any new ones? If there's anybody that...
Again, they're all represented by lawyers. I would assume that there's a possibility that if lawyers should leave the practice or for some reason not be able to represent them, others like myself will pitch in and take them, sure.
This is really interesting because, we have no idea in the United States. I'm sure I don't know, my viewers probably, maybe some of my viewers know, but I bet a lot of them don't. They don't know what's going on there. You just think that they go to Guantanamo and that's where they stay, and we don't hear about them. We don't know what's going on with them. It's just like it's like it never
Suzanne,
it's like it never even happened.
That's exactly right. That's one of the reasons that they selected Guantanamo, because the administration right after 9/11 felt, let's just move them all there, get them as far away from America as possible, where they aren't going to be able to have the full range of legal protections, and maybe people won't notice what a miscarriage of justice is happening in Guantanamo.
Gosh, this is one of the reasons I have the show on the air, because I try to show when I do shows that something that doesn't get on other